Before we get to the story, I'd like to say thanks so much for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading cosmic horror related stories every single day. So if that sounds good, please drop a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot, especially when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. Cave biology is a field that selects for a specific kind of patience. The patience of someone who can spend a week underground in conditions that most people would find unbearable and find the work genuinely absorbing rather than merely tolerable. The darkness, the cold, the physical difficulty of moving through karst systems that weren't designed for human access. None of it registers as deprivation once you've been doing it long enough. What registers is the biology, the extraordinary life that fills spaces where life shouldn't be able to exist, and the persistent sense that the systems you're working in are always more complex than the current survey is equipped to reveal. I had been doing cave biology fieldwork for 9 years by the time the Vietnam expedition went out, working primarily on karst systems in Southeast Asia, where the geological conditions produce some of the most extensive and biologically rich cave networks in the world. The survey project was funded by a conservation institute and tasked with biological assessment of a largely unexplored karst massif in the mountains of northern Vietnam, the kind of work that existed at the intersection of pure science and practical conservation need, generating species inventories and ecosystem assessments that informed protection decisions. The team was compact and experienced. Myself as the lead biologist, a cave mapper named Durr, who had been surveying karst systems for 15 years, and whose spatial memory in underground environments was the best I had encountered in a decade of fieldwork. A caver and rigging specialist named Rook, who handled the technical access challenges that karst systems regularly produced, and a field assistant named Vale, who was in his 3rd year and had developed the combination of physical capability and biological awareness that the work required. The first 11 days of the survey were productive in the ordinary way of good cave biology fieldwork, finding and documenting species in the expected categories: the cave-adapted invertebrates and fish, and the microbial communities that formed the base of the cave ecosystem, building the species inventory that the conservation assessment required. The cave system was rich by any standard, and the team was generating good data, and the work was going the way good work went when the conditions aligned with the effort. Rook found the passage on day 12. She had been pushing a survey branch in the deepest section of the main chamber complex we had been working, a passage that the team's mapping had flagged as potentially continuing beyond what the initial survey had been able to confirm, and she had gone in alone at the end of a survey day, while the rest of us were doing data entry at the base camp we had established inside the cave system. She came back 2 hours later and said, without particular drama, that the passage continued, and that at its end there was a connection to something below that she wanted to show me before she put it in the map. We went the following morning, Rook and I, and the passage was narrow enough to require crawling for its full 40-meter length before it opened into a vertical section that Rook had rigged with a handline that dropped about 8 meters to a floor below. The air coming up through the opening was the first thing I noticed, warmer than the rest of the cave system by a margin that the temperature differential between cave zones didn't account for. and carrying a biological scent that I spent several minutes trying to place against my experience of cave environments before accepting that I couldn't place it. It wasn't the mineral smell of sterile cave air, and it wasn't the familiar smell of the cave biological communities I had been working in for 11 days. It was something else, organic and dense and entirely unfamiliar. We dropped through. The chamber below was larger than the passage above it suggested, the kind of spatial surprise that karst systems produced when the geology below a constriction opened unexpectedly, and in the beam of my headlamp, it extended in multiple directions beyond the immediate landing area. The floor was covered in a biological growth that wasn't the microbial mats I was accustomed to seeing on cave floors. It was structured, organized in a way that microbial communities weren't usually organized, with a texture and a pattern that resolved under closer examination into something that looked less like a mat and more like a network. Fine filaments connecting nodes of denser biological material in a web that extended across the entire visible floor surface. Rook was looking at the walls. The walls of the chamber were covered in organisms I couldn't immediately categorize, things attached to the rock surface in configurations that didn't match any cave fauna in my reference framework. Not the expected cave invertebrates, not the adapted versions of surface species that cave biology normally dealt with, but organisms with body plans that didn't correspond to anything in my training. I collected samples carefully, following field protocol, and while I was collecting, Rook was quiet in a way that Rook was rarely quiet underground. And when I looked up from the sampling, she was standing very still, with her lamp pointed at a passage opening on the far side of the chamber. Something had moved in the passage. Not dramatically, not in a way that required a response. A movement, a displacement of something in the passage opening that resolved when I looked directly at it into nothing visible. But the movement had been there, and Rook had seen it, and we both stood for a moment in the way that people stood in underground spaces when they had just perceived something they were still processing. We documented what we could in that first visit and went back up, and I spent the evening going through the samples, and what they showed me under the field microscope was the beginning of the understanding that kept building across the following days. The organisms from the wall of the chamber had cellular structures that didn't match any biological group I had reference material for. Not cave-adapted surface organisms, not variations on known cave taxa. Something with a cellular architecture that my training in standard biological classification didn't accommodate, as if the organisms had been running an independent evolutionary program for long enough that their fundamental biology had gone somewhere that surface life hadn't gone. The full team went into the deep system the following day, and we spent 3 days in it, mapping and sampling and documenting, and the picture that the mapping produced was the detail that changed the character of the expedition from a biology survey into something I still don't have a professional category for. The biological community in the deep system was not distributed the way cave biological communities distributed themselves. Cave ecosystems organized around resources, around the water flow that carried organic input from the surface, around the spatial distribution of the chemical energy sources that supported the food web. The distribution reflected the distribution of what the ecosystem needed to function. The deep systems community didn't distribute around resources, It distributed around a direction. Durr was the one who saw it in the mapping data first, which made sense because Durr saw spatial patterns before anyone else did. He laid out the survey data on his mapping tablet on the second evening and showed me the distribution of biological density across the system, the way the concentration of organisms increased consistently toward the deepest point of the system, a chamber that the mapping suggested sat at the system's geometric center. Everything in the deep system faced inward. The network on the floor, the organisms on the walls, the movements Rook and I had been catching at the edges of our lamps throughout the survey days. All of it oriented toward the deepest chamber in the center of the system, with a consistency that resource distribution didn't produce, and that I spent the evening trying to explain with resource distribution models before I accepted that it wasn't resource distribution. The ecosystem was facing something. The whole biological community, every organism in the system, oriented toward whatever was in the deepest chamber, the way a plant oriented towards light. Except that there was no light in the deepest chamber, and the orientation wasn't growth tropism, but something more deliberate, more organized, more like attention than like growth. We reached the deepest chamber on the final day of the expedition, Rook and I going ahead of the others, while Durr and Vale completed the peripheral mapping. The passage to it was navigable, and the chamber itself was accessible without technical rigging, and we went in with full documentation equipment and the particular alertness of people who had spent 4 days understanding that something in this chamber was the organizing center of a biological community that shouldn't exist. The chamber was roughly circular, and the ceiling was higher than our lamps could fully illuminate, and the floor had the same networked growth as the surrounding system, but denser, more organized. The filaments connecting nodes that were larger than anything we had seen in the outer passages. It was in the chamber's center. I want to be honest about the limits of what I can tell you here, which are the limits of what my documentation captured and what my training gave me the language to describe. It was large, which I can say with confidence because the chamber gave me reference points for scale, and the thing in the center of it exceeded my expectations for the size of any cave organism. It was alive in the full biological sense, moving in the slow way of something that didn't have a reason to move quickly, with a surface texture that the camera resolved into detail that Priel, the taxonomic consultant I sent the documentation to after the expedition, described in her review as unlike any biological material in any category she had professional experience with. It was aware of us. I don't use that phrase carelessly. I've been doing cave biology for 11 years, and I have encountered a lot of organisms in a lot of cave systems, and I have professional habits around not projecting cognitive states onto biological entities that don't warrant that projection. What I'm describing isn't a projection. The organism in the center of that chamber oriented toward us when we entered, and the orientation was not the reflexive response to stimulus that photosensitive or chemosensitive organisms produced, not the simple tropism that basic sensory systems generated. It was the orientation of something that had registered our presence as a new category of thing and was directing its full attention at that new category. It looked at us with the attention of something that had been in the dark for a very long time, with only the cave's other inhabitants for company, and we were something It had no category for, and the looking had a quality that I have been trying to find the right description for since the expedition, and that the closest I have come to is hunger, except that hunger implied a relationship between the looker and the looked at that I don't think was what was happening. It was more like the attention of something encountering genuine novelty for what appeared, given the circumstances, to be the first time in its existence, and the full undivided character of that attention directed at the two of us in that chamber was the most frightening experience of my professional life and of my life in general. We documented it, photographs and video and measurements at the distance we were at, which was 15 meters, and which neither of us chose to reduce. Then we backed out of the chamber and went back through the system and up through the passage and out into the surface air. And I sat outside the cave entrance for a while in the daylight that the thing in the chamber had never experienced, and thought about what we had just seen. The documentation went to the Funding Institute with the full expedition report, and the Institute's response arrived faster than expedition reports typically generated responses, routing through a specialist team that contacted us within 2 weeks, requesting the complete raw data rather than the processed findings. The specialist team went to the site before any of our findings went through the standard publication process, which we were told was standard procedure for significant cave biology discoveries, and which had the specific character of something other than standard procedure. The specialist team's assessment was never shared with us. I checked the site status a year later through the Vietnamese forestry authority that managed the karst area. The cave system's main entrance was listed in their records as unchanged. The passage Rook had found on day 12 was not listed in any records, which was consistent with its not having been officially documented before our expedition. A contact in the local research community told me, in an informal conversation, that a steel gate had been installed in the section of the cave system corresponding to Rook's Passage, installed by a team whose authorization the forestry authority said they had no record of. The gate is locked. Whatever is in the deepest chamber of that system is still there, in the dark, in the center of the biological community that has been oriented around it for longer than surface biology has looked anything like it currently does. It has been there through whatever geological and biological history has happened above it, unchanged in the specific way of something that the environment around it has not been able to change. It looked at us with the attention of something encountering something new. I think about what new meant in that context, what the span of time was during which nothing new had come through that passage, and what it would mean to exist in a biological community of organisms that had never been anything other than familiar. Waiting without knowing you were waiting for something that finally arrived. I think about the gate. I think whoever installed it made the same judgment Rook and I made standing 15 meters from it in the chamber, which was that 15 meters was the right distance and that reducing it would be a mistake. The gate is the right instinct. I just hope it's enough.